Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Sanka. I'm here with Shiran Illanperuma, who's a journalist and a researcher, especially on economic matters these days. He's very well known for his opinions and views on economic programs that are quite interesting. So we are trying to have a little chit chat on what the hell is going in Sri Lanka. Yesterday, Ranil became prime minister. He's now the prime minister for the fifth time. Certainly, some people are cheering, having parties. Most of them are from the Western diplomatic community in Colombo. The Americans couldn't literally hold the excitement, and they were tweeting just minutes later to show how excited they are because they got their man. But the question is, did the people got their man just like the Americans think they got their man? Or the people are getting any of the solutions that they were demanding for the last several decades, and especially in the last month with the goal-face protest and the island-wide Aragalaya campaigns going on. On the same hand, Basil managed to survive the political crisis by being invisible and pulling strings. As the only Rajapaksa with any say now, he managed to kind of eliminate Mahinda from the scene for his own benefit. And the Rajapaksas, because of Ranil, as everyone expect, managed to secure a deal to stay safe, not just for themselves physically, but also for their looted wealth. So all the larger Rajapaksa family can stay in comfortable lifestyles with the money that we have them accumulate over the years. But what is actually going on? I think these questions are quite legitimate. That the confusion the people have, whether the 17th time we are going to the IMF would be any different, any better. Would it do anything different or do what we couldn't do in the last 16 times with the IMF formula? Is that going to be on the table? Does Ranil have the vision to industrialize the country, to address the trade deficit? All the previous 4 times as prime minister, he was focusing on the service sector but not the manufacturing sector. He's a firm believer on the neoliberal world order, the neoliberal economic format, and the IMF is the ultimate end objective of him and most of the people who understand what the IMF is, and also people who want to pretend that they understand economics and try to adopt the liberal Toya narrative because they want to be like Toya. I was also quite upset with the violence that happened because I'm 38 years old, much older than my colleague here, Shiran. So I remember the times of violence. I remember politicians went after the opposition sides whenever they got a chance after election. I remember how the houses were burned and people were executed in the streets, women raped and stripped and abused. And I'm a bit scared that the country will go back to that culture from now onwards, because somehow other people will come to power in the future, and they would want to take revenge, to seek some sort of street justice. So this is another issue, and then the behavior of Anura and Sajid Premadasa, who pushed the entire political system into accepting Ranil as the prime minister, is also another factor that we should think about. The misplaced idea of them doing power politics right now, them choosing to do power politics right now for them to gain the most of a future election instead of jumping into the fire with the people, to stand with the people. It's going to be a disaster. And now we have Ranil Wickremesinghe, some say Ranil Rajapaksha. I think the second part matches him quite now. And then with that, I want to ask Shiran, how do you see this chaos? How do you make sense of it?
I don't know how to make sense of it, but certainly, like you, I was very uneasy about the violence that happened. So, to preface, I think the attack on the Gotagama protests was obviously like morally unjustifiable, and also a severe miscalculation by the Rajpaksas. I don't know what they were thinking or who was pulling the strings, but it backfired. That said, the violence that was unleashed in response, I don't buy into the narrative that this was 100% organic, because there is precedent for this before. It's not the first time it's happened. And maybe people in my generation or people from Colombo might not remember, but I talked to a lot of people from different walks of life, different age groups, and especially I've spoken to people from the old school sort of SLFP, old school LSSP, CP, and it was really when JR came into power in 77 that unleashed this culture of burning houses, especially during politically tense moments. First thing JR's thugs did was go to all the left and SLFP houses and just burn them, and then this became a culture. It became part of political retaliation every time someone wins an election. So it wasn't just the UNP. 17 years later, when Chandrika came into power, the SLFP did it. And it became very much embedded. And there are, like, I know for a fact that there are elderly people in the South who come from political families. And by political families, I don't necessarily mean MPs, but just, local level organizers. If they're from one party, they genuinely get scared when the other party wins, because they still remember their house being burned. They say, oh no, our house is going to be burned. There are people like that, right? Maybe not so much in Colombo, but certainly in parts of the South, in Gaul, Matra, Hamantoda, that's a thing. So when this happened, that was my first thought, actually. It's like, oh shit, this is bad. And it's not going to end here, because even if the Rajpaksas are out, the electorate that they represent are still there. Those grassroots organizers are still there, and they will reorganize at a certain point. And if and when they win another election, they will want revenge.
Yes.
So I see this as very dangerous and a beginning of a cycle. My second point is that, like I said earlier, I don't fully buy that this is 100% authentic. Like,
Yes.
if you worked around politics, you know how it works at the grassroots level. There are organizers, there are WhatsApp groups, Facebook groups. You just need a nudge, right? You need someone to ignite the flame, and then of course people are angry enough to join. But you need a nudge. And looking at some of the MPs whose houses were burnt and some of the targets, I think you have to be pretty silly or ignorant of politics in this country to assume that these were all organic. No, there was very clearly, some political parties in the opposition that must have been guiding the violence to attack certain MPs and to kind of, wipe them off the board to, prepare for their next election campaign, basically.
And another thing I was quite worried about the violence is that, I'm not against people taking up arms. By default, the population of a country have the ultimate right to take up arms. The right the government exercise, any government of any nation state exercise to bear arms is actually a right borrowed from the population. And if you think about the Sri Lankan tradition, the state never actually, very rarely the king actually exercised the right to give a capital punishment to a person. And capital punishment was given randomly by the Portuguese, was one of the major contributing factors for the Sinhalese rural populations to rise up against him, because they were just killing people left, right and center. And in Sri Lankan tradition, even the king would not do that. He would not behead people every other day. So it used to be very rare. So taking up arms, even in the Protestant Western tradition of Marxism or capitalism, still is recognized. And even in Sri Lankan tradition, the Sri Lankan old heritage, it is the people who have the right. So I'm not against it. As long as the violence contributed to a political cause or a social development cause that actually wish to transform the country for the betterment of the larger population, then the violence can be justified. But on the first day, I understand if the people didn't give the retribution instantly to the SLPP thugs who came and their associates, the government would have won the balance of power. So there is a justification of balance of power on the first day. But then what happened afterwards? It only invited anarchy in the bad sense. There's anarchy in the good sense, but it was anarchy in the bad sense, because it invited India, or they created an opportunity for India to create a pretext. If they want to intervene militarily or otherwise, they could have. And this has been India's interest all along. This is what they did in '86, and we paid a heavy price for their presence. The JVP insurrection killed between 60,000 and 120,000 people. I was in grade 1 when the then government of UMP, Sajid Premadasa's father, his Piyanan, closed all the schools for the second half of the year, the 6 months in 89. And that 6 months period is the period that they hunted down anyone, including JVP and the people who belong to SLFP or the other left parties, and even a pretty girl in the village that the police officer or the local UMP thug desired, and she was refusing so far. So it have bad connotations. It created a bad context, and the violence also pushed the entire political leadership, the entire ruling class, the left, right, and center, all of them, into accepting a person like Ranil, a rotten political figure whose political policies have no mileage. They have no walk, they have no talk within the people. He's more pro IMF than IMF itself. I'm not challenging Ranil understands economy better than most of the other liberals, of course, but to attempt, that is for the neoliberal end, to increase the service sector and keep us as a service provider to the richer industrialized nation, keep us as a market for the industrialized nation. So this violence, either by design or by coincidence, end up pushing Sri Lanka to a worse off place, as far as I understand. And right now, with Ranil on power, most of the fake protesters are happy because they got their man, so why should we protest? And all the other protesters who were there from the beginning, who are protesting for a larger cause other than to get their man on power, are still there. They are confused, and yeah. So I agree with your violence. Violence was not going where it should have gone if it was going to be violence at all. It is bad on a political culture level, and also political strategically, it was a disaster. But do you think Ranil will do anything different? Will any different IMF solution would come this time, different from the last 16 times?
So I think the only question regarding Ranil right now is whether he's going to prioritize political reform or economic reform, right? So I think the consensus, even among Ranil's traditional supporters, is that from 2015 onwards, the Yapana government was somewhat prioritizing political reforms, mainly because with Maithripala and parts of the SLFP there, they couldn't really push, hardcore neoliberal programs of, the privatization and all that. They really couldn't do that.
Yes.
And so it's interesting because some of the economists, I can't remember who now, but they said it themselves. The mistake was that they were prioritizing these pie-in-the-sky reforms, your constitutional reforms, Office of Missing Persons, and all of that, and maybe even federalism as part of the constitutional package. Those things never materialized, and they lost a grand opportunity to power through the economic reforms. Now it's complete chaos, right? No party has a real economic program, right? Every party is now busy politicking, planning for the next election, putting conditions on, when they want to come into power, what they want to do when they're in power, blah, blah, blah. So I think this gives Ranil a free hand to implement the IMF reforms, basically unfiltered, basically unopposed. And I think so if we divide the sort of center right in Sri Lanka, the traditional UNP base, into like the politically oriented and the economically oriented, I think the economically oriented people should be somewhat happy because Ranil is going to do what you want. The politically oriented will be somewhat upset because I'm not sure whether this time he's going to, think about abolishing executive and all of that. I think they're just going to get the economic stuff done.
And partly because I think Ranil, for right or wrong, he might also want to still be the executive president, so he's not going to abolish it, no matter what he says, because this is the best opportunity he had since 2004. I mean, and I was politically active. That was the first presidential general election campaign that I was politically active, so I remember how happy I was when he actually lost the goddamn election. But I am confused on one thing before I want to say that I'm quite disappointed on the political game, the deals Anurukumara Disanayake of JVP and Sajid Premdas of SJB made, I find that very treacherous. They betrayed their sacred duty to serve the country and the people that they say they are the opposition to. You know, they are the parliamentary opposition, and they say they represent the larger population as a parliamentary opposition, but they actually completely ran away from their responsibility. I understand it was a smart move from their perspective, okay, we let the country burn, we don't care, we let whoever put their neck on the line to manage this crisis burn. And then let's wait and see everyone else is burned, the field is clean, and then we'll go all in for the next general election and then try to increase our number of MPs and share a cut of the cake, you know. And I find this a great treacherous thing that they did, because that's not what the country needs. The country the people need leaders, elected leaders jumping into the fire with them. People are burning and they are actually just waiting and sipping wine and sipping whatever they are sipping or whatever juice and then waiting and having this carnival show. And people are paying with their lives, people are paying with a hungry stomach. So this is unacceptable. The responsibility of Ranil being the Prime Minister and the bitter pill that they are going to force down 90% of the population is also with the SJB and JVP, because they should have actually taken over. They had the legitimacy to do it. They could have actually developed a set of solutions that are people-based instead of the IMF-based. Now, since we have gone to the IMF, of course, I understand you can't really withdraw because we have declared default, bankruptcy in a way. But still, you could have talked to the people and get them involved in developing the solutions that the country needs. Figure out a proper decolonization strategy to completely reform, transform the state in the long run. And they could have done this, and people would remember them as true leaders, and no matter how hard it is for them right now, they would have been promptly rewarded in the next election. And secondly, Ranil, I think he's going to continue this bitter pill nonsense. Despite that 90% of our subsidies are given to the 10% of the population, be it fuel, transport, electricity. And so it's going to be a very hard time for the population to go through.
Yeah. Actually, a quick one. I was, I heard that a lot, right? That the majority of the subsidies are enjoyed by the top 10% or whatever percent of the population, right? And I've heard this so many times, and I always thought that's a very convincing argument, actually, to remove subsidies. But then I went into the household income and expenditure surveys and actually looked sort of deeper into it. So obviously the top percentage of the population, the wealthiest, they consume more. Therefore, they'll get a larger portion of the subsidy. But then if you look at the low percentage of society and look at what they consume, right? That from their basket of consumption, a bigger part of that consumption is transport, a bigger part is food, right? A bigger part is fuel. Those are all things that are influenced by subsidies. So even though the majority of subsidies are consumed by the rich, for poor, a bigger portion of their consumption requires subsidies. So even if you remove the subsidies, actually it's the bottom whose consumption will be reduced the most, not the top. That's one point, but that's economical. The second is what you said about SJB and JVP. I think if you're politically shrewd, nobody wants to be in power right now except Ranil Wickremesinghe, because he's the only guy who's ideologically committed to this neoliberal program and has the ties with the West and the IMF. So nobody wants to be the guy to increase the taxes or to increase the electricity bill. So Ranil's going to do that. I think SJB and JVP are happy to sit in the opposition and make use of the sort of the social problems that this will create. I think ideally both parties would want a situation where SJB can be the ruling party and JVP can be the opposition party, and you get rid of all these other people. Because JVP has always wanted that. They've always wanted to replace the SLFP and the traditional left, and SJB wants to replace the UNP. I think that's the equilibrium we'll go for. I want to put a quick devil's advocate question to you. You mentioned about Sajid not coming into power, right? But the condition was that Gota has to resign for him to come into
Yes.
power. So, what do you think of this question? Does there have to be an interim government first, or should Gota resign for
Actually, as far
Sajid
as
to
I understand, lot of there were other people who were willing to form the nucleus of an interim government to bring stability and allow a period for Gota to go. There were people from the SLPP who actually took a risk at their own life in doing it. I don't want to put the name because I don't want to embarrass them anymore, because they actually came forward when no one wanted to do anything.
Yeah.
And they would have been much better for economically Sri Lanka, because they would have worked with all the wider spectrum of the political parties and the larger population, unlike Ranil, who have no mandate or the connection to the population or the political setup of the country anymore.
Right.
Gota will not go for two reasons. One, if he goes right now, the last bargaining chip Rajapakshas have to keep their money and their families safe, their lives literally safe, is going to disappear. And they are not going to go because of it. One. Secondly, to remove him, it will take around 2 years. So by that time, the presidency's term is anyway over. So the other option is to actually take up arms and go for a civil war and try to go to the president's home and then execute him, like in the good old days of the French Revolution or what, or in the Russian Revolution, October Revolution, the Bolshevik one. That's not going to happen in Sri Lanka. Population is dead against violence. If you see how much counter pressure came from the general population against this stream of house burning and retribution, you can imagine how much pressure there would be, how much less support people would give to such an armed struggle. So yes, you need to send Gota home. Gota need to go home, but in order to do that, we need to have a setup that can guarantee the safety of their lives at least, because that's the minimum condition. And Ranil not only fulfilled this condition, but also fulfilled the condition of them being able to take their money. And we could have actually have a different person from SJB or SLPP or the SLFP or the JVP if Anura and Sajid agreed to work together.
True.
We could have had it. And after a month or two, then we could have actually cut president's budget and make him literally starve to death in the president's house if he choose to stay. I mean, that was a...
Or go for a no confidence motion.
Yeah, even the no confidence motion is not binding, because you have to go to the Supreme Court afterwards. What could have been done is you create a majority in the parliament. Mahinda only had between 50 and 47 people supporting him like 3 weeks ago. And everyone else was willing to support an interim government, and then wanted to talk about how they could actually cut Gota's budget and force him out. And that was a practical solution. But then the problem was SJB and JP both, not only they wanted to wait and see until others burned so they can actually get a better share of power in the next election, they also didn't have any alternative plan. I mean, Sajid, as far as I understand from my friends who actually talk to him on these topics, is very pro green industrialization. He's very pro new technology and all that. But the guy doesn't have any other understanding of the economic issue outside the standard economic format. His economic narrative is overtaken by Harsha De Silva. And JVP, even though they say they are left, they actually they never talk about industrialization.
No, they don't. They're actually very, they're very utopian in their view.
Yeah.
But somehow, on that note, I actually have to run to get...
Thanks, Shiran, for the time, and see you soon.
Thanks for having me.